going to remove alternator from the old and the belt, because the new does not have one. So we'll go with that first, bring you back when that's off, and on to the next item. Alternator's off, and we've got the same bracket there. It's hidden underneath there. So the next thing I want to do is get both these engines on top dead center. So there is a marker there somewhere on the crankshaft pulley end here. There's a slot that would line up there, but I also want to watch. I'm going to take the distributor cap off. This is number 1. I will verify that. I didn't memorize it. So when the rotor is pointing at 1, we should be close with the mark here. So there's a faint yellow there that corresponds to where the number 1 plug is, and as you can see, that rotor is pointing straight at it. So come over here and look, and there are 3 marks on that pulley wheel, and it's the one furthest down that's lined up with the T for top dead center. So interestingly enough, they're all kind of lining up with other marks on there. So now we'll come over and do the same thing on this engine. So this one had 2 marks, not 3. So the lowest one is on T, next one's up is on 10. So should have an alignment here on the end of that camshaft to drive the distributor. Okay, so in this case, those slots that drive the end of the distributor basically straight up and down, and so are those. There we go. So we've got agreement there. I'm going to leave the distributor off for now, so I don't want to risk it while I don't want to risk it while I move things around. Alright, the next thing we're going to work on is this intake area. So we've got the throttle body, it's got a position sensor, we've got the idle air controller down in here, and while we have the same over here, I know that that one is clean and functioning. I guess I can assume this one is. Maybe we'll just check and see. Now back up in there, doesn't look so clean. I know that this position sensor needs to be swapped at the least. So maybe we'll just pull the, I guess we'll compare it. If that one is smaller in diameter, then I would want to keep this one. If I can just swap, there we go. If I can just swap the sensor from one to the other, maybe that's the way to go. This whole linkage looks to be the same. This looks to be the same. That's the same. Alright, I don't know. Maybe we'll just, like I said, keep this the way it is, other than replacing the sensor. We'll do a little more research. I think check and see if that plug is the same between the 2 IACs. Does look to be in a different place. Alright, I'll bring you back when I figure this out. There was a pulley wheel on the water pump. There was the pulleys on the crank, and they came off with force number 10 or 10 millimeters. That was 3 10 millimeters, and then there was a number of 10 millimeters holding the 3 different covers on. So now, again, with the engine already in top dead center, haven't touched it, I'm going to carefully remove the remove everything but the timing belt, because the valve cover, or this rocker cover's got to come off first. So on with that. Oh yeah, for the sake of documentation, these are the screws and nuts that were holding the throttle body for both of the systems on. So I'm going to add all of the screws that were holding the different things I just took off. Mostly that's those timing chain covers, timing belt cover. Put them in there. Well, of course, I should have remembered from before that this is not an easy removal. This has to come off this engine mount bracket because it captures the timing belt coming down through there. I'm going to keep in mind how this is oriented with that longer hook up. I've got the bolts out of both that tensioner and that pulley wheel. But the other thing is I'm going to have to drain the oil and remove the oil pan from underneath because there's no way I can get that timing belt through that crack. And this does not come off. Yeah, maybe it does, but I'll look at the directions, see what they have to say. So the instructions definitely say take this off. When putting it back on, it only goes on one way. And the same thing with the pulley wheel, it's going to be indicated, but the key is this pin is up when everything is in line. There's a kind of a arrow mark up there. That pin is pretty much in line with that. So I've got my impact wrench out, I'll deal with that, and I still will need to clear all of this off so I can get the valve, or I'll call it the valve cover, get it off, and that'll release the timing belt. New engine. Covers are off. That tensioner is different, so we'll have to pay attention to that. I just loosened this bolt. It's really pulled in snug to take in all that slack. But we're going to remove the belt. This is loose. I'll take these two out. That'll allow this part to come out. It's too hard to get to the other side. So we'll finish getting that out. Both water pumps are off. That's the newer one off the old engine. And this is the one that was on this engine. It's got some rust, to be expected having sat for a long time. Can't really tell. Kind of looks like that kind of stamping. It could be original. Who knows? Alright, but they look the same as I expected. So I'm going to bolt the newer one off the old engine into here. Newer water pump is on. Newer timing belt is on. You rotate it clockwise down here. So I made sure that the arrows are pointing, those arrows there are pointing in the direction of rotation. When that mark on the pulley wheel is lined up with the top, there you go. That mark on the front of the crank is lined up with the pointer on the casting. Then you look up here, and the I arrow is pointing at that little rib, and the E arrow is pointing at that little rib. And then the last check is when the idler is tight, and that's snug down, they say a little over 1/4 of an inch of deflection with a reasonable amount of force. And I'm calling that good. So now we can put the covers back on and go from there. I'm going to put the covers back on top of the timing belt and water pump area. And I did reattach this bracket that goes to the engine mount. This is still loose, and I'm going to keep it that way until everything else is buttoned up. I'll pour in, after I drain the oil out, pour in on top some SDP oil treatment before I close it down to pre-lubricate the cams and rockers. So we'll get the screws out of the box and install all the covers on the timing belt. Cover's on. Alternator's on. Belt is tight. Not too tight. All of this connection is back in place. The distributor I decided to install now just to close off this opening. I may regret that decision, but tricky thing, this fit of this key into the slots on the end of the camshaft was very tight. So it was a tap, tap, tap on the end of the end of the shaft coming out that holds the rotor in place, at the same time of snugging down these bolts a few turns at a time. And I've gone back now and I've aligned the distributor to my yellow mark being in the center of the rotor as a starting place, and then snugged up those bolts. So I'm not sure what to go on to next, because I talked about the intake. May as well deal with that. So this is the one, again, off of the 1.6. Here's the 1.8, which I'm pretty sure is larger, but they say that swap the TPS and fix the wires for the IAC. So that's what we'll look into doing. All right, I had hoped it would be less challenging. The first, I won't call it an issue, the first challenge was getting that distributor on. Now, here is the TPS off of the 1.8 liter, the new engine. That is what drives it. It's just a blade coming out of the throttle shaft. And here we are on the 1.6. That is not a blade. That is something bigger. And what it drives is different. So we are going to have to go back and reinstall this TPS onto this and do a little more research. After my discovery the other night, maybe it was last night, maybe it was longer ago than that, that this, which is the throttle position sensor, or TPS, is different on the 1.6 than the 97 version of 1.8. Of course, if I'd gotten a 96 or older, it would have been the same. But I've done some measurements and determined that the bore through this throttle body is the same on both of these. I know initially my sketchy tape measuring indicated different, but when I got calipers out, they are the same. The bolt pattern, the face, the gasket, everything else is the same. So the 1.6 throttle body, as is, will be going onto the 1.8 engine. This 1.8 throttle body will go into the box o' spares. So onward and forward with that. We'll put this throttle body back together, screw it back on, and decide what's going back on that engine next. So this is my list of things that are getting moved around. We already discussed the throttle body. We'll come back to some of these other things. We'll go ahead and go to the bottom because I can find the coolant temp sensor. It sits right next to the thermostat. I've already loosened it. This is the old one, the one that I'm going to move. Make sure I get the, there's some sort of gasket there, I believe. There it is. All right, so that's the one going on. And that was a 19 millimeter. And here's the one coming off. They look exactly the same. They may be. But that one's kind of grungy looking. So I think it's good that we're there. Kind of grungy looking compared to the other one. So this, with its washer, is going into the box. And I'll screw the new one in, tighten it up, 19 millimeter. and we'll cross that one off the list. The last thing that I did before calling it a night is I bolted on this drive shaft, mid shaft. I'm not sure what it's called. Whole pattern's the same. I heard some story about I'm going to need a different half shaft coming off of that. I don't know. We'll have to actually install the engine drivetrain before we determine that. All right, here's the list. I got the O2 sensor off, but not without a whole lot of beating and banging. Going through the rest of the list. Still not sure about the fuel rail wiring harness. It's something I can swap after the engine's back in place if I choose. And the same thing with the VICS delete if I really want to go through that. Haven't decided yet. But back to what it was necessary to do to get the O2 sensor off. Yeah, it's pretty beat up. There's a shroud around the head of the hex of the O2 sensor that wouldn't let me really get too much bite with anything on it. So I ground some of that away. Then I ended up taking and cutting the connector off. So I have to resolder that, and then took a deep well 22 millimeter socket, impact socket, and putting a pipe wrench on it and being able to rotate it out now. So I got to put that back together. But as far as what I'm going to do here, drain the oil, pour in the oil treatment, and replace the, well, don't need to replace the oil filter at this point, but I will before I put the engine in. And then install the rocker cover here. And then it should be ready to roll out into the driveway and clean. So we'll do that, come back. So I really hate when I spend the money to buy parts and they're not right. So this is the gasket that came off of the 1.6. This is the gasket that supposedly goes on the 1.8. And at first glance, you're like, all right, well, that's good. That's pretty close. Well, see how this necks in? And see how that's straight-sided? I can't get this to go into the slot of the cover. The other issue I'm dealing with is that the location of the holes, and then this hole, I mean, it's just not the same. It's just not, this end is not good. So the old one goes back on. Fortunately, that's on top of the engine. I can deal with it. So those front cross member supports are now on a 4x4 or a 4x6 on dollies, and I sort of began pushing the car out so that I can take it out into the driveway and clean all that yuckiness. I got the valve cover on. One key thing was to make sure that you put a little RTV for the joints, and that was with the old gasket on. I did about 75 inch-pounds, which is the high side. The other thing I did was go through and connect up any loose fittings, and also taped off. Oh, got to get the end of the throttle body taped over, or somehow plugged. I don't want to blast water into vacuum lines or anything like that. Electrical connectors will dry out. I don't really want to fill the intake manifold with water either that I'm blasting, so I'll do that, and then I'll be done to push this out into the driveway tomorrow, hopefully. Got some decent weather before it gets yucky again. Things are a little cleaner in there. A little bit less in the way of grease and grime. And then, Engine isn't great, but it'll do. A few more things getting cleaned. Engine mounts, that's the power steering brackets, and then the lower support beam. So I think we're done cleaning. So we're looking at the old engine, the 1.6, and it does appear to have some semblance of V-riz coming off here down there. So hopefully the same wiring will work on this version of V-riz on the new engine. The other thing is, everything I've read says I'm best in swapping this fuel rail wire harness. My first check was this connector looks the same number of pins, but the wire colors are different. I don't know if that's a Kia thing or if there is indeed a difference between the BP and the 1.6. So regardless, we'll swap them. I think the injectors will have the same plug configuration. There's the fuel rail harness out of the old engine. Very brittle connectors at the injectors. I need to be more careful not to break, and they'll still go in and stay in. But it required unscrewing and removing the fuel rail in order to get to releasing the harness, which is underneath those lines, tubes. So hopefully I got enough photos to be able to put it all back together again. This is one of those situations where we have extra plugs. I'm pretty sure one of these extends out and will plug into something. I compared something that's already in the engine compartment. Is that the right side? No, in the engine compartment. How's that? There we go. Here is the ends. This is a very different connector coming through there. This is the BP, the new engine harness. This one I found a home for. This one I found a home for, but there is, and then these are just going down to the injectors. So everything is put back here where it needs to be and plugged in. Hoses are plugged back in, but again, we've got I'm thinking 2 or 3. The other thing I just finished doing was putting on the oil pressure tap with the feed for the oil pressure sender. I think we're kind of down to the end of stuff here.